I will not go through a long history of what Stalin did, his accomplishments and his demerits. Most of those things you can find in ordinary bourgeois books. I want to go over the things that you're not going to hear from anybody except a Stalin supporter like myself. Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. Lenin died. He was the leader of the Russian Revolution. And he led the Russian Revolution in 1917 out of World War I. And he died in 1924, and Stalin became the leader of the party at that point. So he pretty much was leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. And that's 29 years of time. That's a lot of things to talk about. I don't think the mic is dead. I don't think it's going.
Oh.
Or did you just turn it down?
If that helps, you can turn it on. It wasn't supposed to be on.
Okay, all right. So in 29 years, a lot of things happened, and I don't think in the hour that we're here, we're going to be able to go over all of them. So I'm here more to present you some of the provocative things that you need to look for when you study this question yourself or when you come across it. In 1 minute, I can tell you what Stalin's accomplishments were. He led the fastest industrialization in the world seen up to that point. He applied Lenin's thought to do this. He moved so fast that this was a factor in why Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. When he gave his last testament in 1945, Hitler said that he always had a nightmare night after night before 1941 that Stalin would move first, that Stalin would be improving the situation in the Soviet Union, and that he would actually attack Germany before Hitler got around to attacking him. And this is because the degree to which Hitler respected Stalin for what he was doing at the time, knowing that this was a worthwhile adversary. I'm going to pass around the statistics on that. You often don't hear about the comparative statistics on the industrialization in the Soviet Union. But, for instance, in the 1930s, the United States was in a depression. In fact, all the Western capitalist industrial countries were in a depression, and the economies were stagnating. So if you were a business person at that time, you can read this in business papers, equivalent to the Wall Street Journal at that time. Even there, you would see that admissions that the Soviet Union was growing economically and was going to leave capitalism in the dust. So if you lived in the 1930s, that's what you thought. You thought, that things look like capitalism is going to be ground into the dust. It's in the midst of a huge crisis, double-digit unemployment, and Stalin's Soviet Union is growing and growing. And I'm going to pass around some figures on that, comparative figures that show the situation with the Soviet Union compared with that of the United States, Britain, Germany, and France, which are the other major industrial powers at the time. This graph here just kind of shows you the black bar is the Soviet industrial growth going up and up, and in the same years you can kind of see a stagnation of the major industrial capitalist countries. We're going to come back to that because establishing a developed industrial society that quickly was what got a lot of attention in the Third World, especially after World War II, when the Soviet Union became the number 1 or 2 superpower in the world. It was a very clear situation after World War II, after 1945, that the Soviet Union emerged under Stalin as one of the top 2 military powers in the world. Now that doesn't have any meaning to you unless you understand, of course, the history behind that as well. This is another why we call this an accomplishment. Russia was not always the number 2 or number 1 military power in the world. In fact, just in 1905, Japan beat it very soundly in a war on Russia's east coast. And in 1917, Russia was so pathetic. I mean, it was pretty much soldiers going into battle with pitchforks. They were being destroyed on the front with Germany. And if you, I'll show you a picture of this later, but if you know the map of Europe, there's Germany in the middle, France on the left side, or the west side, and Russia way over here. And so the Germans were pretty much cakewalking to this direction, and they won their battle with the Russians. took up tons of territory, and even under Lenin, they had to surrender all the Ukraine to the Germans when they asked for it. And you may have heard in World War I that the real battle was in the trenches between Germany and France. Millions of people lost their lives in this really slow and methodical war in which people were dug down in trenches and they shot each other. That was the tough battle at the time. France and Germany going at each other with England backing up France. So Russia was nothing. The top military powers were Germany, England, France, United States. That's what it was when the Russian Revolution came about. But a mere 20 years later, mostly under Stalin's leadership, the situation was different, and the Soviet Union became a military power, and that's largely because of the industrial situation. Let me just read one quote from a book that came out just in 1998. It's called Stalingrad. It's about the most important battle of World War II. The importance of the industrialization under Stalin to the outcome of World War II. By the way, this book is by Anthony Beevor. During the summer, this was after Germany attacked in 1941, when Germany was producing approximately 500 tanks a month, General Halder had told Hitler that the Soviet Union was producing 1,200 a month. The Fuhrer had slammed the table and said it simply was not possible. Now, the Fuhrer, this is Hitler, the Nazi leader of Germany, was furious to hear that, wow, Stalin was outproducing me in tanks. And in fact, Beevor continues. He says, even this figure was far too low. In 1942, Soviet tank production was rising from 11,000 during the first 6 months to 13,600 during the second half of the year, an average of over 2,200 a month. So actually, at that point, under Stalin, from a situation of vast military inferiority, the Soviet Union went to producing more than 4 times as many tanks as Germany per month. And these were not low-quality tanks. The Germans had a hard time piercing the armor of these tanks. And in fact, they were superior to the German tanks in quality as well, at least in many important regards. So, and usually you can read any bourgeois history book and they'll tell you the industrial statistics of the time, the growth under Stalin, steel tons, the aluminum, the glass. And you can get lost in those kind of historical facts. So that's why I'm going to try to keep this brief. There's 2 more things I want to mention in his accomplishments to sum them up historically. This is covering, again, 30 years of time. He was the first to lead the collectivization of agriculture. This happened as the United States was having its own Dust Bowl depression, and the so-called NEP in the Soviet Union was running out of steam. Agricultural production was decreasing instead of making more grain available to the cities and feeding more people. And Stalin came in and, no doubt with brutal force, collectivized agriculture. And that meant that people who had previously sold things on the free market, sold their grain, their foodstuffs, now were in collective farms, trying to put their livestock together and having their produce taken to the cities, more or less by force, but with the help, cooperation of the lower and middle peasants, who, contrary to what you hear a lot these days, a lot of them really did hate the rich peasants, the landlords, not to mention the landlords who had been expropriated under Lenin, but who hated the so-called kulaks. So that's the first time that had happened in history, and it laid the basis for the industrialization that I had just already discussed. Fourth thing I want to mention about Stalin's accomplishments was the staunch political leadership that he provided through that whole period of time that essentially saw, 5 years after his coming to power, the global depression and the onset of World War II. Now, the West, the United States in particular, likes to tell you that World War II started in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. But we communists don't quite see it that way because Italy invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia. Before that, Japan was attacking the Soviet Union and landing in Manchuria in China. So there were a lot of invasions by the so-called Axis powers, those were Germany, Italy, and Japan at that time, that were already in motion. Not to mention that even in Europe, of course, Czechoslovakia was taken in '38, just taken apart by the Germans. So we don't agree with that conception, but point being that from 1924 to 1953, Stalin saw the Great Depression, World War II, and then just before, as he was dying, the Korean War. And he provided the staunch political leadership through this whole time that prepared the Soviet Union to win against Hitler, protect itself, and emerge as a respected superpower. Some of the things he did that were notable in this regard, I'll just mention Spain, sending weapons to Spain in the 1930s, especially the Civil War hit its peak around '36. The only country in the world that was willing to do that, that's the only government in the whole world that sent weapons to the anti-fascist, anti-Nazi side in Spain. And you hear a lot of things now today about Stalin did this and that to mess up the resistance movement in Spain, but this is essentially an argument amongst friends in Spain. There was no other country, not the United States, not France, not England, none of these people that claim to have been such great anti-fascists, none of them sent any actual military aid to the Spanish when they were fighting against fascists armed and trained by the Germans. And if you, to locate this in history for you, may have heard Picasso, and this famous painting, I think it's called La Guernica, is about the first bombing, modern bombing of history. It's about Spain. It's because the Germans had arranged for bombings of the so-called Republicans in Spain, the anti-Nazi side. And that horror occurred and went on without any response from the supposedly great anti-fascists of the United States, France, England, and so on. So that's the kind of staunch person that Stalin was, is that while these others were more powerful but too afraid to fight Hitler, Stalin, put the Russian government out on a limb and fought by proxy in Spain. Another thing that he did, and this gets to why he's so infamous as well as famous, infamous in bourgeois eyes, was his treatment of the internal enemies in the Soviet Union. He called them class enemies. And it was at this time, and the whole time while these attacks on the internal enemies in the Soviet Union were occurring, this took a very staunch hand. It was done with the explanation and justification that the Soviet Union was already engaged in a war, class war internally, but also a war with external enemies. Hitler made it very clear when he wrote his Mein Kampf book that he was coming for Russia. This was already, by the time Stalin was coming to power. Most people believed, Stalin included, that it was a matter of time before World War I resumed, and the Germans came again. It was only a question of when. When are the Germans going to come again? This is the history. World War I is over, but the Russians still expect the Germans to come again, and they're right. And there's a famous quote from 1929 in which Stalin predicted that we have 10 years to industrialize or be crushed. He goes through, he laid it out for his peoples. We have 10 years to get ready, and if we don't do it, we will be crushed. So let me, just one more point about his accomplishments. I'm going to return to this Beevor book. Most of you have heard about these arduous things, the purges, executions, which could have been anywhere from hundreds of thousands into the millions of internal enemies in the Soviet Union, people that we call over here probably dissidents, probably a lot of people who aren't even necessarily that outspoken, but who somehow got in the way, to describe it literally in the words of some of the Soviet people, got in the way of preparing for the war. And we're not at all denying that this happened, that there were executions and people who seemed to be screwing up the war effort were essentially gotten out of the way, that were executed. Now, I'm going to tell you a quote from something, this is coming out now. This is something you won't necessarily read in some of your dusty old books, because this is, again, material that keeps coming out as time goes on and World War II passes. Something you may not have heard is that in the Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of all of World War II, 50,000 Russians were armed and fighting on the German side. And this is 6th Army, this is a quote from before, 6th Army had over, this is Nazi Army, had over 50,000 Russian auxiliaries attached to its frontline divisions, representing over a quarter of their strength. To give you a description of some of the things that were done. This is something getting into the national question as well. Yeah. Oh, thanks. The German officers were so happy with the way that the traitors were performing that they lauded them with extreme praise. And Bevor, he openly wonders, you know, during the whole Battle of Stalingrad, why the Germans didn't give up. But I think it's even more amazing the Russians didn't give up. The Russians who were fighting on the Nazi side, and it's not just Russians, I simplify when I say Russians, I should say Soviet peoples. Why did they continue to fight? Well, after a certain point, yes, they had to fight because they didn't fight and they lost, they knew they were going to be executed. I mean, when you're a traitor and you lose the war, it's pretty obvious that afterwards you're going to be executed for crime. So they expected, that's one reason they fought. But listen to some what the Nazis had to say about some of these traitors. Quote, especially brave were the Tartars, reported an officer in the factory district of Stalingrad. Quote, as anti-tank gunners using a captured Russian weapon, they were proud of every Soviet tank they hit. These fellows were fantastic, unquote. Lieutenant Colonel Mader's group, based on 2 grenadier regiments from the 297th Infantry Division at the southernmost point of the Kessel, contained no fewer than 780, quote, combat-willing Russians, unquote, nearly half his force. That's something you don't hear a lot about. That, yeah, Stalin was known for executing a lot of people, but still, when it came down to it, there were 50,000 Soviet peoples fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad on the wrong side. And as the Stalinists would say after that, in other words, there were 50,000 people who should have been executed before the war got that far, who weren't. And that's a brutal truth. That's a harsh reality to accept. Now, why do we say that? Well, it's a life or death situation. It's something that we, in our comfort right now in 1999, don't often face. We start to see a little bit in the Balkans what goes on with ethnic cleansing and the brutality of that kind of war. But the Russians, let's not forget, a good estimate of the number of people they lost in the war was 27 million people. 27 million. When you talk about the Jewish Holocaust, we're talking about 6 million people. That's like one of the most horrific events in history. We're talking about 27 million Russians in the same period of time. So we know, wow, this is something that we in 1999 probably can't even relate to on any level. Just can't relate to it. So I'm here telling you some very harsh things. Yes, Stalin executed at least hundreds of thousands of people in his reign. That's the low-end estimates, and some people will tell you millions, and I'll get into that later. But we have to look at the context that this was done in. Russia, or excuse me, the Soviet Union was always between a rock and a hard place. 1924, only a couple of years had passed before the imperialist armies had withdrawn from the Soviet Union. What do I mean, imperialist armies? I mean English troops on Soviet soil. I mean French military invasion. You know, this was going on in the Civil War of the USSR, and the Russians remember this, and they're right. The Germans are coming. They're coming again. So this is something to consider about the times. I don't want you to just, I want when you look at the Stalin history, and like I say, I only have an hour, we're not going to get into all of it. This is the question I want you to have in your mind. In that context, was there a better solution to defend yourself as a person, as a nation? Was there a better solution than Stalin? It's easy. I can tell you I'm a Stalinist, and I will tell you those were horrible times. No Stalinist is going to deny that to this current day. Those were horrible times. The question is, when you are in horrible times, what is what is the best of all possible solutions to your predicament? And in this, we find that Stalin still stands out. Now, the Battle of Stalingrad, by the way, 500,000, just in that battle alone, 500,000 Russians died. Okay, that's the largest battle, single battle in history. And I want to pass around the map because I know that a lot of this World War II history is being lost completely in people's minds, but it's still kind of seeping out. We're still people who were keeping quiet during the war and the aftermath because of the Cold War are now starting to write books, and we're starting to see some things that are continue to vindicate Stalin. I'm going to pass around this map in case you don't know how far Hitler and the Nazis got into the Soviet Union. This map here shows, you know, like I was saying before, Germany kind of in the center of Europe, and they marched through Poland and Czechoslovakia, through the so-called Balkan countries that we hear about today, and penetrated into the Soviet Union. And you're going to see from this map how far he got, because I'm going to tell you, he got all the way over here to the east, to Stalingrad. That's the big battle where it finally turned around. Hitler marched all the way through Europe, all the way through Eastern Europe, all the way up to Stalingrad. All right? And so this is the map. Take a look at it. If you're not aware of how far Hitler got, this is something you need to know. You need to understand. You need to understand the times Hitler was popular. He had support of government figures, not just in Germany, not just in Austria, which joined up with Germany. But you may have heard of this term Quisling. Well, this comes from traitors, we call them now, but they were actually government officials in the case of Norway, also in Finland, who became Nazis. They overthrew their existing governments because they liked this Nazi idea and they wanted to join up. So when 3 million troops invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, let me read you who it was. It wasn't just Germans. Okay, there were 79 German divisions. This is a quote from Bruce Franklin, by the way. He's an English professor. He's one of those professors, by the way, who in the great United States has been fired from his job for political reasons. I won't get into that. But he explains it here. There were 79 German divisions, okay, that we expect, marching into the Soviet Union. But there were 22 Romanian divisions. There was a civil war in Romania in which the Nazis won. The Nazi pro-fascist side won. 14 Finnish divisions, 13 Hungarian divisions, 10 Italian, we knew about the Italians, 10 Italian divisions, 1 Slovak division, 1 Spanish division, we knew about that, that there was a split in Spain. A total of well over 3 million troops, the best armed and most experienced in the world, attacked along a 2,000-mile front. So I'm telling you, Hitler, fascism, Nazism, these ideas were, we have to understand, they were popular at the time. They were exterminated by history. But don't think it was easy. That's the thing. They were widely popular at the time. They were so popular that in France, remember now, France was the tough guy in Europe in World War I, you know, where they had the trench warfare and they duked it out for a few square yards of turf, and millions would die over it, just, you know, the mud basically. If you moved the lines forward a few yards, moving back would cost you tens of thousands of lives. France was tough. In World War II, France collapsed in 6 weeks. Why? Because the French people were in confusion. They had poor leadership. They were part of a capitalist country that had no resistance to fascism as an ideology. They had no organized resistance. They didn't have purges. They didn't crush their dissidents that were pro. In fact, now it's coming out in 1994. There was a book published finally that Mitterrand, the president of France, up until 1994, I'm talking about somebody you were alive to be contemporary of. The president of France, turns out, and this is published in the Boston Globe now as well, you can check it out, the references are on our website. He was a bootlicking officer. He was not only a member of a fascist party when he was 19, okay, 19-year-olds make mistakes, but he continued, he was an assistant to the leader of the so-called Vichy government of France, which was the Nazis' puppet government in France. And not only did he serve as an assistant and win awards as such during World War II, but he continued, after World War II was over and the Germans had lost, he continued to lay flowers on the grave of the leaders of the Vichy government. And this is all documented. This is in a large book. So some of these people, and there's also the same situation in Italy when the Cold War is over. If the Cold War was not over, some of these things you still wouldn't be learning. For instance, the Italian government also at the very top levels, into the 1990s, was staffed by people who were former fascists. Yeah, and they had in their coalitions people who were former fascists. Now, why did that happen? Well, the Cold War, it takes some explanation, but basically the United States sided with anybody in Europe who was against the Soviet Union. That included the former Nazis. Okay, so that stuff's starting to creep out, but I want to come back to my original point. My original point was that at the time, you have to remember, in the 30s and 40s, fascism was popular in Europe. Okay, it took 27 million Russian lives to exterminate, to make this idea unpopular, so that some of us don't even know what it is, right? I'm sure. But at the time, it was very popular, and to get to how Russia went from being the wimp of Europe to being able to beat the Germans pretty much single-handedly has to do with industrialization, has to do with Stalin, has to do with Marxism, and that's Stalin's accomplishment. Now, I want to come back to that's it I'm going to say about accomplishments. That took me a lot longer than I thought. The one drawback, I can boil it down to one sentence, is that he had an inadequate concept of class struggle. Now, what does that mean? It means he was purging, and this is admitted by his second or third in command after Stalin died. He was purging, he was killing off his enemies through this whole time, not so much around 1924, not in the 1920s. Things were fairly easygoing then. But in the 30s and the 40s, especially in the 30s, he was killing off his internal enemies, and they kept reappearing. Now, the problem with Stalin's idea about this, as summed up by Bukharin, we have to give Bukharin credit on this one point. Now, I'm going to point to this guy. That's how you spell his name. Bukharin was wrong about most things in our opinion, but this one thing he got right. He said that, according to Stalin's strange conception of class struggle, the class struggle intensifies the further socialism goes along. And, in fact, it intensifies and becomes more violent, just as the bourgeoisie is wiped out. Because according to Stalin, there's no longer an internal class. There is no bourgeoisie. There are no landlords anymore. So this was Stalin's conception that they have socialism now. There is no landlord class. There is no bourgeoisie anymore. Yet, all these people still had to be killed. He was finding all these enemies. So something was, something's not together. And later Mao put this together and he said, no, there is an internal enemy that continues to exist even under socialism. This is an argument we can have later. And the bourgeoisie, the new exploiter class, arises right in the Communist Party itself because it has access to the means of production. Okay, so this is, when it comes to Stalin, he would keep killing people off who were enemies, and in the main, we think he did hit the right people. Now that's controversial, deservedly so. But he didn't have any idea how to keep the enemies from arising in the first place. This was more Mao's idea in the Cultural Revolution, was what things you have to do under socialism and economic organization to prevent a bourgeoisie from arising in the first place in the party, to whatever extent you can. So that's, to boil it all down, in our opinion, what his drawback was, is that there's no bourgeoisie, according to Stalin, anymore under socialism. Now, how does this, I'm going to relate this to all this over here. I'm boiling all this down very simplistically. Okay? It's hard, but these three graphs over here are basically all the same thing. The idea of a U-curve is actually pretty important in the way we communists think. Just to take this one. Gandhi liberated India in 1947, or he was the leader in the movement. I don't know if you can say he liberated. Everybody knows he was a pacifist. He was for nonviolence. Did not organize armies to kill off the English to get them out. But India continued to suffer from starvation. And where it started out ahead of China in life expectancy, when they were liberated, they fell behind. Why? Mao used violence. He used violence against the landlord classes, against the occupiers. And he installed collective agriculture. And now, after a few years, China isn't behind India anymore. Why? Because peasants aren't starving to death. That's the bottom line. Starving to death. To this day, in India and pretty much the rest of the subcontinent, millions of children are starving to death each year. And that adds up very quickly to more than war. This is something that I myself, was surprised to find out when I was studying the causes of violence and what I was going to do with my life. I thought, probably war was a good place to start, figure out what the causes of war are and why this evil comes about. Turns out, war doesn't add up nearly as quickly as starving peasants, if you want to count the dead bodies. Okay, so let me back up. These curves, I'm telling you, yeah, Mao used more violence. Okay, Gandhi hardly used any. He didn't use any. There was a rebellion within military units in India. But he's famous for this. But the landlord stayed in power. So he wasn't actively shooting people, but he was letting people starve. We would say that people have an ethical responsibility to each other. If people are starving to death, and that starvation is preventable, then that's no different than being shot to death. We count that as violence. That's how we look at it. A lot of people don't. Now let me get into that's exactly where we're going to start to separate from, well, the predominant point of view in the United States would be some kind of Christian idea, right? Well, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. Well, it's only 10 of 8. You might as well go home, because if you're a Christian, there's nothing I can say to you. If you're really hardcore believe that thou shalt not kill is what God said, and if I don't do what God said, I'm going to hell, or if there's no hell, I should go to heaven at least by carrying this out, I can't argue. If you're right, you're right. Okay, there's nothing we Stalinists can say to you. If it's thou shalt not kill, there's no doubt Stalin was bad. He killed. Okay, so the question is, from our point of view as Marxists, we call it idealism. The afterlife idea, God, Christianity, that's idealism. Trotskyism is another kind of idealism for the most part. Why? Because they're not telling us about things that were actually possible in the real world. In fact, a real Christian will say, well, even if I could save someone, I will not kill someone. If I could save 2 people, if I could save 10 people, I will not kill someone because it's what? Thou shalt not kill, right? And when I put up graphs like this and start talking about the numbers of people who die, you're going to hear someone say, either thou shalt not kill, that's one of them. The other one you hear a lot is, ends don't justify the means, right? Which is another way of saying, don't calculate it out. You should have principles against violence. And therefore Stalin was bad because he was violent. Well, we're not going to deny Stalin was violent. So it really does come down to this question. Are you living in this world, and do you concern yourself with this world, or are you more concerned with your afterlife? Now, there are a lot of idealists who don't realize that they think the way Christians do. I would say most academics, in fact, think the way Christians do unconsciously. But unless you can show a choice that was less violent, and you can show us how it would have worked, we're not going to be persuaded. So we're not going to hear it when you say the ends don't justify the means. No, because we know that if Stalin hadn't slave-drived the Soviet Union the way he did, they would have lost. Because you just saw that map I handed around, okay? Hitler, even though Stalin, drove the Russian people into the ground, drove the Soviet peoples into the ground to make them industrialized, Hitler still almost won the war. Now let me tell you a few things. When they got to Stalingrad, the Germans held most of Stalingrad. When they came, they bombed it to smithereens, and the troops came in. The Russians held part of one hill on the river. Okay, you saw the river that's kind of separating European Soviet Union from the rest of Asia, which is very sparsely populated, right? The Russians held part of one hill and a pocket here and there. Most of Stalingrad was occupied by the Germans. The Germans they came very close to winning that battle. That's what I'm here to tell you. Okay? And it's so obvious to people who know this history that even Gorbachev, who obviously hated Stalin, and was the great hero of the United States, even he, when he had a review done of this question, didn't believe that there was any option like what Buchanan was saying or other people were saying when it came to World War II. He did not even believe that because it was that close. If you had slowed down the pace, if you said, okay, let's go a more relaxed pace to industrialization, let's not kill off people who make mistakes, let's not kill off people who aren't, you know, gung-ho enough, let's not kill off people who are sowing intellectual doubt. You know, Trotsky being the #1 intellectual doubter who predicted that Stalin would lose World War II, he predicted this openly throughout the 30s. Let's not kill off those kind of people. This was not a choice that the Soviets had. They almost lost it. They gave up 27 million people and still just barely won that war. That's what you need to understand. So, returning to this question of the grass, why I did this. It's a question of reality. You know, it's like if you go see the movie Matrix, you get to pick the red pill or the blue pill. Okay, taking the red pill is not pleasant. This is not pleasant at all if you go see this movie. But it's the truth. Okay, now I'm telling you that from our point of view, the truth involves mostly a description of how much violence and death there's going to be given certain paths. We're saying we can prove that there's more violence and death because of the road Gandhi took. We're saying there would have been more violence and death if Buchanan had his way. Buchanan did not want to force collectivized agriculture, although he admitted he was wrong later, but in the 20s, late 20s, early 30s, he did not want this to happen. Did not want so many people executed for getting confused and screwing up industrialization, or for being saboteurs. They were called wreckers, of which anti-communists from the United States did in fact witness. There's books published about this, people who were wrecking Soviet industry. Buchanan wanted a more laid-back approach. Not a lot more, but significantly more. And even Gorbachev felt, you know, after reviewing the history, this was not an option. Buchanan was one of the major leaders in the Soviet Communist Party, and that was his plan. And the Central Committee rejected it. They picked Stalin. Trotsky's was another plan we can talk about. Probably some of you have something to say about that. I think I'll skip over this for a while. We can come back. This is something, another graph here, that concerned Stalin at the end of his life in 1952. He wrote a book about this. The leaders that came after him, Molotov, for instance, admitted he didn't really fully understand these issues, and that's why I kind of needed Stalin around. But so when Stalin died, he wasn't able to handle it. Khrushchev also didn't understand the basic Marxist theory behind the so-called law of value, although it's very central to Marxist theory. Well, maybe we can get to that later. I want to get into the national question, because that's how we build this talk, talking about, you know, why is it that people who were contemporaries or even a generation after Stalin supported him? People like Paul Robeson, Du Bois, here, of course, you know about him. Liu Xun, the greatest modern Chinese writer in history, was a supporter of Stalin. In fact, he wrote polemics against Trotskyists in China, saying exactly what I'm telling you about religion and idealism. He was saying, I'm afraid you look so loftily into the sky that you will fall flat on the ground. In other words, that he's telling the Trotskyists to get over their religious inclinations and deal with the reality as it faces them. The Black Panther Party, David Hilliard was chief of staff, and he, in that party of the 60s, he had the poster of Stalin on his wall. Huey Newton was a big supporter of Stalin and Mao, of course. Mao Zedong was his most important descendant, ideologically speaking. And Mao Zedong, in turn, influenced a lot of people because he liberated China by force in 1949, kicking the Japanese out first and then fighting the U.S.-backed puppets. But that was very influential in how to decolonize throughout Africa and Asia. So in the 60s, you saw all these armed struggles arise throughout those third world countries, pretty much following in Mao's footsteps and liberating country after country from colonialism. So you hear this decolonization. Now, the connection of Stalin to all that starts in 1913, where he publishes pretty much his only major theoretical work that he's known for, that Lenin asked him to do, which is Marxism and the National Question. So it was Stalin's job. Lenin said, this is your job. Go write us our platform on the national question. What are we going to do about oppressions of nations by other nations? And Stalin, to make a long story short, said that we communists, well, we have this job of ending the oppression of small nations by bigger and more powerful nations, but we also want to use nationalism in a progressive direction that can be a solution, a communist solution of cooperation for the whole world. So we're not just nationalists of the oppressed nations. We're not just for the liberation of small nations, but we want to do it in such a way that it will contribute to global economic cooperation, the communist solution. So he wrote this essay, and I'll just quote one thing from it. This is pretty famous. You hear it quoted again and again by various organizations. A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. So it was four things. Having a common language, common territory, economic intercourse, trade amongst yourselves, and culture, psychological makeup, four things. And he said, if you have these things, then you're going to have a force at work called the nation, a force that we have to account for in our calculations, because we are trying to figure out the way forward to a cooperative economic future, or one with less violence. And we have to account for this factor. And it's not something religious or as a matter of high-sounding principle, capital P, or God. It's just, if you have those four things together in history, Stalin claims that there's going to be a force involved, and you're going to have to deal with it. And we should deal with it in such a way that it contributes to liberation. So, that's just theory. In actuality, Stalin was more known for being the applicator, the person who was most trusted to apply Lenin's thought. And that's what he claimed to be, and frankly, his critics would also say that he was not very original. This was criticism. So he was more or less trusted by the majority. Even before they came to power, he got the highest number of votes to be on the newspaper central committee. So he was trusted as someone who would apply things more than as someone who would come up with entirely new theories. So his influence through the national liberation struggles up to the present day comes from the things I was already talking about. Number one was development. He showed that a country could develop without slavery, without taking over other countries, without setting up some kind of tribute system so that, well, this country over here, you have to send me so much tax dollars a year. None of that. Stalin showed this could be done in 10 or 15 years. It was brutal, but he showed it could be done very quickly. And this was something that all third world peoples after World War II had in mind. They didn't, colonialism of other countries wasn't an option. Taking hundreds of millions or tens of millions of slaves from some other country was not an option. So building up your wealth, how to do it. Stalin seemed like the fastest, the best, the most just example in history thus far. That's one reason. So people like Liu Shan and Mao Zedong looked up to him. In addition to this, he wrote the theory question. Another reason I also touched on already is that because he shared a lot in common with Mao, and he was actively involved as a practitioner of national liberation struggle. In fact, he turned the whole communist movement to the east, we say. Because if you know the history of the communist movement, in the teens and the 1920s, even Lenin and people like Trotsky, most of the famous communists were in Europe. And they thought there was a good chance, and they were right. They thought Germany would go down for a communist revolution, and it came really close in 1923. Didn't happen. But at the time, everybody, because of the millions of people who belonged to communist clubs in Germany, and because of the horrors of the World War I, a lot of people thought Europe was going to go for it. Starting with Russia, there was an aborted revolution in Hungary. But Germany came close, and if Germany had gone communist, then it's very possible you would have seen a domino effect through Europe. And that's what most communists at that time and earlier were thinking. It was very Europe-centered. And with Stalin and Lenin in his later life starting in the 20s, Lenin starts to worry that it may not happen in Europe and we may have to hold out for a while and wait. Starting with Stalin, there's more attention to the East, to China, to the colonies, to places where it was supposedly backward, where the working class was supposedly not advanced enough. So the Marxist theory starts to undergo an evolution, and Stalin was a major player in this. Lenin was pushing already in this direction in the last couple of years of his life, but it was Stalin who, you probably already heard this before, he was the one who instigated this idea of socialism in one country, right? He has some quotes from Lenin, but he was known for upholding this idea against Trotsky. And this, again, kind of pushed in the national liberation direction, where nationalists could say, yes, I don't have to wait for the Europeans to come to the communist idea. I don't have to wait for the Germans. It's not going to be the superior, scientifically intelligent workers of Britain or the United States bringing communism to me. Me, I, in the third world, I can make socialism in my country. Okay, so Stalin was a large subjective factor behind why this communist movement changed directions that way. Because it was mostly, let's be truthful, it was mostly a white man's thing up to that point. Even though it obviously had a lot of application elsewhere. But Stalin starts changing the direction, and you get Mao, and you start to develop these theories. And one of the key theories, the theory of the principal contradiction, which we talk about a lot. Today we say the principal contradiction is between the oppressed nations and imperialism. Imperialism being led by the United States. And it was Stalin who really put this theory out first. He was the one saying, well, it didn't work out the way we planned, Germany didn't go down. The advanced, scientifically, most modern workers didn't do it. The weak link of capitalism and imperialism turns out to be in the third world, or the agrarian countries. You call it the weak link. He said, if you grasp this weak link as strongly as you can and you pull on it with all our communist might, if we focus our communist energies there, we will break this link and we will shatter capitalism. So Russia went first, and he believed China could go, a number of other colonies could. So the colonies might actually go first. And he theorized what stages the revolution would have to go through, and that was controversial and so on. But they said the principal contradiction is the one, out of all the struggles you pick, out of all the fights you want to pick, he says, pick the fight where if you win it by grasping with all your might, you're going to advance all the other struggles the most. And he said it, he was the one who said the national liberation struggle might be the one, might be the principal contradiction. So this idea started to come out. And that, to get to that point, Marxism kind of had to go through this theoretical switch, where before you kind of had a global capitalist class fighting a global proletariat. And to schematize it, we used to, and we still do, accuse the Trotskyists of thinking you have to have a simultaneous revolution of the whole global proletariat against the whole global ruling class. And that idea went out with Stalin, and you started breaking it into pieces, into countries. It says, well, maybe this proletariat in this country can win and knock over the ruling class. And when it gets in power, maybe it can even ally with some of the ruling classes of other countries, as we did in World War II, for instance, like the Soviet Union allied with England and France to deal with Germany, right? So this thing, once you go to this one country at a time formulation, kind of changes all of Marxist theory, or at least makes clear what maybe was already there if you read some of the things that Marx had said about Ireland, for instance. So now you have one country flipping over at a time, maybe over here another one, proletariat comes into power. And the theory is that this can go on, and imperialism will be weakened that way, one country at a time. And so the obvious becomes an obvious role for national liberation struggles within that. It says, well, we can actually ally with the bourgeoisie to knock out the imperialists, because the bourgeoisie has an interest in coming to power and knocking out the imperialists. Why? Because the capitalists are divided. Each capitalist wants to be the exploiter his or herself. Microsoft's swinging at it with Apple. That's no longer anymore, right? But, you know, Burger King is fighting with McDonald's. Okay, on a national scale or international scale, the same thing is happening. My country's capitalists want to ice out the other country's capitalists for the business, whether that be profits, imports, resources. And Lenin and Stalin, but Stalin in particular, who applied this the most, said we could take advantage of that. We can take advantage of those divisions. We can take advantage of the division between Germany and England. Germany wanted England's colonies. We can take advantage of that. We can side with part of the bourgeoisie, in essence, part of the capitalist class, because there are national struggles going on. That just means that there are different class struggles. It's not a class struggle on the whole world plane, ruling class on the top and the proletariat and the peasants on the bottom. That's a very simplistic view. Stalin says it's more complicated than that. We have to understand the national question. We have to look at class struggles in each country. It's not that we're against class struggle now. It's that we think different class struggles are important than what we used to think. Okay, we can ally with certain classes, and we'll still be engaged in class struggles, and we're still trying to get the classes on the bottom on top. But it's not a simple simultaneous thing where the bottom allies against the top. Okay, so that's Stalin's contribution, and by industrializing and becoming powerful, he was the one who made that happen. So we have decolonization that followed, a number of countries looking to the Soviet Union as a way to develop. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I think this is probably a good time to. I'm sure I said enough controversial things. Why don't we enter into? I know we have some argument coming up.